Two cowboys disappeared in the Coyote Ridge Desert in 1873. 14 years later, their skeletons were found in a mine. Some treasures are worth more than gold. Some secrets are worth dying for. What I'm about to tell you defies explanation. In the scorching deserts of Arizona Territory, I discovered the story of two men who vanished without a trace, only to be found 14 years later in a sealed underground chamber, their skeletons perfectly positioned as if still guarding ancient secrets. This is their story, as I pieced it together through recovered journals, witness testimonies, and the haunting testimonials of those who dared to seek the truth. But I warn you, some mysteries change those who dare to uncover them. Death rode with them that morning, though neither man knew it yet. I've spent the last 5 years researching this case, and every piece of evidence I uncovered pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. Let me tell you how it all began on that fateful October morning in 1873. I found the first account in the personal diary of Maria Gonzalez, a local seamstress who lived across from the boarding house in Bitter Creek. She wrote that the sun had not yet kissed the jagged peaks of Coyote Ridge when she saw Luis, the hunter, Medina, step out of the weathered boarding house, his spurs singing their familiar death song against the wooden planks. According to every witness I interviewed, this would be the last sunrise Luis Medina would see as a living man. From Maria's detailed description, I learned that Luis was a predator carved from the desert itself. Weathered brown skin stretched over angular bones, eyes the color of polished obsidian that had witnessed too much blood and betrayal in his 43 years. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with barbed wire, broken horses, and knife fights, trembled slightly as he rolled his morning cigarette that day. Not from fear. Everyone I spoke to confirmed that Luis, the hunter, Medina, feared nothing that walked, crawled, or breathed, but from anticipation that had been building in his chest like a gathering storm. According to the records I found, today would change everything. Thomas, I read in Maria's diary that Luis called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through silk. "Let's go, boy." The desert doesn't wait for sleepyheads, and neither does death. I discovered through multiple sources that from the shadows of the stable emerged Thomas Rivers, 19 years old, and still carrying the soft edges of youth despite 2 years under Luis's brutal tutelage. Where Luis was all hard angles and weathered leather, Thomas possessed an eager energy that reminded the older cowboy of his own lost innocence, before the desert had claimed it, before the killing had begun. The boy had no idea he was walking toward his grave. Through the testimonies I collected, I learned that Thomas's dark hair caught the first rays of sunlight as he led their horses into the dusty street, his movements quick and efficient despite the early hour. His hands shook too, but from excitement, rather than the bone-deep knowing that had settled into Luis's soul like poison. The map, Luis, I found recorded in Thomas's own journal, which I discovered years later. I dreamed about it again last night. The mine, the copper veins running through the rock like rivers of molten gold. We're going to find it, aren't we? We're going to be rich. Rich beyond imagination, or dead before sunset. As I learned from the Apache elders I interviewed, sometimes the desert didn't distinguish between the two. From Luis's personal effects, I found a note he'd written that morning. "Dreams are just dreams, boy, but sometimes the desert shows us exactly what we need to see, and sometimes what we see kills us." He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. I interviewed every living witness I could find who remembered that morning. They all told me the same thing. The town of Bitter Creek was still asleep around them, its collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts huddled together like cattle sensing wolves in the darkness. Only the saloon showed signs of life, with the occasional drunk stumbling out into the growing daylight, squinting against the sun like a man staring into the gates of hell. In 12 hours, this sleepy town would begin 14 years of nightmares. The most detailed account came from Mary Santos herself, now an elderly woman of 92 when I interviewed her in 1920. She remembered appearing at her window as the two men prepared to mount their horses. She had been a beautiful woman of 25 then, with the kind of dark eyes that seemed to hold all the mysteries of the desert and all its sorrows. For months, she told me, she had been watching Thomas with the patient attention of a woman who recognized love even when the man himself remained blind to it. She would spend the next 14 years watching for his return. "Be careful out there," Mary remembered calling softly, though her words were meant for Thomas alone. She told me the desert air carried her voice like a prayer, like a warning, like a curse. The desert keeps what it wants to keep. How could she have known she was speaking prophecy? Through my research, I learned that Thomas tipped his hat to her, his cheeks coloring slightly beneath the morning sun. "We'll be back before the next full moon, Mary, with enough copper to buy you the prettiest dress in all of Arizona territory, maybe even a wedding dress." He would never see another full moon. Neither of them would. Mary told me those words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Her hand flew to her throat, and for a moment, her eyes widened as if she'd seen something, a vision, a glimpse of the future written in blood and bone across the desert sky. "Thomas," she whispered, but the words died on her lips. I found in the stable records that Luis mounted his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Hope, a name that would prove bitterly ironic. As Thomas swung up onto his own mount, a young stallion, with fire still burning in his eyes, witnesses told me Luis felt that familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded their most dangerous expeditions. But this time was different. This time, the tightening felt like a noose. Through my investigation of Dutch Williams's estate, I discovered how they'd acquired the map. It had come to them through a chain of whispered conversations and late night card games in the back room of O'Malley's saloon. The old prospector, dying slowly from lung rot, had pressed the yellowed paper into Luis's hands with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. "Found it in a dead Apache's pouch," Dutch had wheezed. According to the saloon owner's testimony, I uncovered. "Been carrying it for 20 years, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to follow it. The mine's real, Luis. I saw it with my own eyes. But something isn't right about that place." Through my research into Dutch's background, I learned he had been a respected prospector for over 3 decades, known for his honesty and keen eye for valuable deposits. His warnings carried weight in the mining community, which made Luis and Thomas's decision to ignore them all the more puzzling. I found records showing Dutch had discovered 3 successful silver mines in his career, making him wealthy enough to retire comfortably. Yet he continued prospecting, driven by something deeper than mere greed. I discovered through medical records that the old man died 3 days later, taking his warnings to the grave. But the map remained, its faded ink showing a route through the treacherous canyons and hidden valleys of Coyote Ridge, leading to a symbol that looked like a doorway carved into living rock. During my research, I found additional documentation about the map's origins. According to Apache tribal records I was granted access to, the pouch Dutch claimed to have found belonged to a medicine man named Walking Bear, who had disappeared in 1852 during a vision quest to Coyote Ridge. The tribal elders I interviewed told me Walking Bear had been attempting to seal something that should never have been disturbed, but he never returned from his mission. From multiple eyewitness accounts, I pieced together how they rode out of Bitter Creek that morning, the sun climbing steadily into a sky the color of faded turquoise. Neither man spoke of the stories that had begun circulating about their destination. Tales of strange lights seen dancing in the desert at night. Stories of men who had ventured into those particular canyons and returned changed, their eyes holding a haunted quality that never quite faded. Through my extensive interviews with surviving residents of Bitter Creek, I learned about the escalating series of warnings the two men had received. Father Miguel Santos, the local priest, had actually visited them the night before their departure, begging them to reconsider their expedition. According to his personal diary, which I found in the church archives, the priest had experienced disturbing dreams about the two cowboys for weeks leading up to their departure. "I saw them in my dreams," Father Santos had written, "sitting in a place of eternal darkness, their souls trapped between this world and the next. I begged them not to go, but Luis laughed and said, dreams were just the fevered imaginings of old men who had spent too much time in the desert sun." I also discovered through my research that Dr. James Harrison, the town's physician, had examined both men at Mary Santos's request just days before their departure. His medical notes, preserved in the territorial health records, showed both cowboys to be in excellent physical condition. However, Dr. Harrison noted some concerning observations in his private journal. "Both men display an unusual level of nervous energy," he wrote. "Luis in particular seems driven by something beyond normal ambition. When I asked him about his dreams, his eyes took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing something I could not. Thomas appears to be following Luis out of loyalty rather than genuine conviction, which concerns me greatly." Through witness testimonies, I learned that as they rode through the outskirts of Bitter Creek, several residents tried one final time to dissuade them. Old Miguel Torres, a former Apache scout, actually rode after them for the first mile, pleading with them to turn back. "That place is not meant for white men," Torres had warned, according to his grandson's testimony. "The spirits there are old and angry. They have been waiting for someone to break the seals that keep them contained." But I found that Luis had dismissed all warnings with a confidence born of 2 decades surviving in the Arizona wilderness. Thomas's journal entries from that morning show he was beginning to have second thoughts, but his loyalty to Luis and his dreams of wealth kept him moving forward. From the detailed tracking work I conducted at the site, I learned their horses carried them steadily northeast through increasingly rugged terrain. The desert around them was a study in contradictions, beautiful and deadly, ancient and eternally changing. Giant saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in permanent supplication to the merciless sky. Palo Verde trees offered patches of shade that seemed almost miraculous in the growing heat, while roadrunners darted between the rocks with the quick efficiency of creatures who understood that survival was a daily negotiation with death. Through my geological surveys, I discovered that by midday, they had climbed into the foothills of Coyote Ridge, following game trails that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into a landscape that felt increasingly alien. The silence here was different from the comfortable quiet of the open desert. This was a heavier silence, pregnant with the weight of secrets and the accumulated whispers of centuries. I found Thomas's exact words preserved in his journal. "Look at this rock formation. The map shows these landmarks. We're on the right path, Luis." Through my analysis of the geological formations, I confirmed that the red sandstone pillars Thomas noted thrust up from the earth like the fingers of a buried giant. These formations, I learned through consulting with geological experts, were over 200 million years old, formed during a time when this desert was an ancient sea. The Apache considered these pillars sacred, believing them to be the petrified remains of ancient guardians watching over the land. Luis's journal entries from this point show he was beginning to experience the same unsettling sensations that would plague their entire expedition. "Something about the landscape is beginning to trouble me," he wrote. "The shadows fall wrong here, too deep and too dark for the time of day. And there's a quality to the light that reminds me of the moments just before a thunderstorm, though not a cloud mars the brilliant blue of the sky." Through my meteorological research, I found that this area of Coyote Ridge was known for unusual atmospheric phenomena. Local weather patterns often created temperature inversions that could cause strange optical effects, making shadows appear deeper and light take on an otherworldly quality. However, Apache spiritual beliefs held that these effects were caused by the presence of powerful spirits inhabiting the area. From their detailed journal entries, I learned they made camp that first night in a sheltered alcove, building a small fire from dead mesquite wood and sharing a simple meal of beans and hardtack. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Thomas pulled out the map again, studying it by firelight with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "According to this, we should reach the mine entrance tomorrow afternoon," I found recorded in Thomas's journal. "Dutch marked a spring, about 2 miles from the site. We can water the horses there and approach the mine fresh." I discovered through my archaeological work that this spring still exists today, though it's now much smaller than it was in 1873. The geological survey records I examined show that the water table in this area has dropped significantly over the past 150 years due to increased mining and settlement activity throughout the territory. Luis's entry from that evening reveals the depth of his internal conflict. "Thomas, what do you know about the Apache beliefs concerning this area?" From Thomas's response, preserved in his journal, I learned the younger man's knowledge was limited but troubling. "I know they consider it sacred or cursed. The stories aren't always clear about which." Through my extensive research with Apache tribal historians, I learned that the distinction between sacred and cursed was largely a European concept. To the Apache, certain places possessed powerful spiritual energy that could be either beneficial or dangerous, depending on how they were approached and what intentions the visitor brought with them. Luis's journal contains a detailed account of the conversation that followed. Sacred and cursed sometimes amount to the same thing. "My grandmother was Apache. She used to tell stories about places where the spirits of the earth had been wounded, places where men had dug too deep and disturbed things that were meant to stay buried." Through my genealogical research, I confirmed that Luis's grandmother, Elena Medina, had indeed been Apache. Born in 1790, she had been captured during a raid on a Spanish settlement and later married Luis's grandfather, a Mexican vaquero. Her stories, passed down through the family, contain detailed knowledge of sacred sites throughout the Southwest. From Luis's journal, I learned that a coyote howled somewhere in the darkness that night, its voice rising and falling like a lament. The sound was answered by others, until the night seemed filled with their wild chorus. Thomas had asked, though his tone was gentle and affectionate, "You're not getting cold feet, are you, old man?" Luis's response, preserved in his own handwriting, shows his characteristic mix of caution and determination. "Cold feet have kept me alive this long, boy. But no, I'm not backing out. Just remembering things my grandmother told me about respecting the desert and the spirits that live in it." Through my research into Apache spiritual practices, I learned that coyotes were considered messenger spirits, often appearing to warn of spiritual danger. The The fact that multiple coyotes called that night would have been seen as a particularly strong warning by anyone familiar with traditional beliefs. I found that they slept fitfully that night, their dreams filled with visions of copper veins running through stone like blood through flesh, and somewhere in the darkness, the sound of whispers in a language neither man recognized, but both somehow understood. Thomas wrote the next morning, I dreamed of ancient voices calling my name, speaking in words that seemed to bypass my ears and go directly into my mind. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with a quality to the light that seemed almost crystalline. They broke camp early, following the map deeper into the maze of canyons and hidden valleys that made up the heart of Coyote Ridge. Through my topographical analysis, I learned the landscape here was older, more primal, as if they were traveling backward through time to an era when the world was still learning how to be itself. By noon, they had found the spring marked on Dutch's map, a small pool of clear water nestled in a grove of ancient cottonwoods whose massive trunks spoke of centuries of patient growth. Through my botanical research, I determined these trees were over 400 years old, making them among the oldest living things in the region. The Apache considered such ancient groves to be gathering places for spirits, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. I found detailed descriptions in both journals of how the horses drank gratefully, while Luis and Thomas refilled their water bags and prepared for the final approach to the mine. There, Thomas wrote, pointing to a narrow canyon that cut into the face of a red rock mesa like a knife wound. The entrance should be at the back of that canyon, hidden behind a rockfall. Through my geological analysis of the area, I confirmed that this canyon was formed by millions of years of water erosion, creating a natural corridor that penetrated deep into the mesa. The Apache name for this formation translates roughly to the throat of the earth spirit, reflecting their belief that it was a gateway to the underworld. Luis's final entry before entering the canyon reveals his growing unease. I studied the formation through my field glasses, noting the way the shadows seemed to pool at the canyon's mouth like dark water. We'll leave the horses here. The canyon looks too narrow for them, and we might need to move quickly if we need to leave in a hurry. Through my investigation of their final preparations, I learned they cached most of their supplies at the spring, taking only what they would need for the exploration: ropes, picks, shovels, their lanterns, and enough food and water for 2 days. The horses they hobbled in the shade of the cottonwoods, where they would have water and grass, while their masters explored the secrets of the hidden mine. What neither man realized, as I discovered through my research into Apache oral histories, was that by entering the canyon on October 16, 1873, they were walking into a carefully laid trap that had been prepared by forces far older and more powerful than anything they could imagine. What do you think drove these two men to ignore all the warnings about Coyote Ridge? Were they brave or foolish? Drop your theories in the comments below, and if this story is already gripping you, hit that like button to help us continue uncovering these forgotten mysteries. Through painstaking research of geological surveys and Apache oral histories, I reconstructed what happened when Luis and Thomas reached their destination. The canyon was indeed narrow, its walls rising on either side like pages of a book opened to reveal some terrible truth. From the evidence I found at the site decades later, their footsteps must have echoed strangely in the confined space, creating sounds that seemed to multiply and distort until they could no longer tell which echoes were their own. I discovered, through archaeological examination, that halfway through the canyon, they found the rockfall Dutch had described, a jumbled mass of boulders that completely blocked the passage. But as I studied the obstruction myself, I could see that it was not entirely natural. Someone had deliberately arranged the rocks to seal whatever lay beyond, using skill and knowledge that spoke of Apache engineering techniques passed down through generations of shamans and medicine men. From Thomas's journal, which I found preserved in remarkable condition due to the dry desert air, I learned his exact words. "Help me move these smaller rocks. There should be a way through. Look here. This stone has been deliberately placed. It's not part of the original collapse." My research indicates it took them 2 hours to clear a passage large enough for a man to crawl through. As they worked, both men noted that the air coming from beyond the rockfall carried a strange scent, not unpleasant, but unlike anything either had encountered before. Thomas described it as almost metallic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded Louise of desert flowers blooming after rain, mixed with something that could only be described as the scent of time itself. When I examined their lanterns years later in the Territorial Museum, I could see from the burn patterns and wick where that they had revealed a tunnel extending into the heart of the mesa, its walls showing clear marks of human excavation. But these were not the rough scrapes of desperate prospectors hacking through stone with crude tools. The tunnel had been carved with almost architectural precision, its surface smooth and perfectly rounded, as if it had been shaped by hands that understood both engineering and artistry. I found Thomas's exact words preserved in his journal. "My God, this isn't just a mine, Luis. Someone built this place. Look at these walls. They're too smooth, too perfect. This is engineering that would challenge our best railroad tunnel crews." From the detailed sketches I discovered among their belongings, I learned they moved forward slowly, their lantern light playing across walls that seemed to absorb and reflect illumination in strange ways. The stone itself appeared to have been treated with some kind of mineral coating that made it shimmer slightly, creating an effect that was both beautiful and unsettling. Every 20 feet or so, they found side passages branching off from the main tunnel, each sealed with carefully placed stones that spoke of the same deliberate engineering they had encountered at the entrance. Luis wrote in his journal, "The Apache sealed this place for a reason. These aren't random closures. They're purposeful, systematic. Someone wanted to control access to specific areas while keeping the main passage open for what? Who were they expecting would come after them?" Through my investigation, I determined the main tunnel continued to descend at a gentle but consistent angle, leading them deeper into the heart of the mesa. The air remained fresh despite their depth, suggesting some kind of sophisticated natural ventilation system that had been incorporated into the tunnel's design. After what felt like an hour of walking, though their pocket watches insisted only 20 minutes had passed, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the ancient inhabitants of the Southwest. From their detailed descriptions, I learned their lanterns could not illuminate the full extent of the space. The lights seemed to be swallowed by darkness that pressed against them like a living thing, but what they could see took their breath away and filled them with a sense of wonder that bordered on spiritual awe. I confirmed through geological analysis that the walls of the chamber were lined with copper or so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. But this wasn't crude or still embedded in raw stone. It had been carefully extracted, refined, and shaped into intricate patterns that covered the walls like a vast work of art. Veins of the metal ran through the stone like rivers of molten fire, creating patterns that were almost hypnotically beautiful and seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The copper had been partially worked into forms that suggested both artistic and practical purposes. I found evidence of tools, ceremonial objects, and decorative elements that demonstrated a level of metallurgical sophistication that shouldn't have existed in pre-Columbian America according to conventional archaeological understanding. Thomas wrote, "It's not just a mine. It's some kind of temple. Look at those symbols carved into the walls. They're not like any Indian writing I've ever seen. They're more complex, more mathematical somehow." Through my research with Apache tribal historians, I learned these symbols resembled traditional pictographs, but were somehow different, more complex, as if they represented ideas that required new forms of expression. The Apache elders I consulted told me these symbols belonged to the first ones, a mysterious people who had inhabited the Southwest long before their own ancestors arrived, possessing knowledge and abilities that seemed almost supernatural. To later generations, throughout the chamber, I cataloged artifacts that spoke of a civilization far more sophisticated than anyone had expected to find in the American desert. The evidence suggested a people who had mastered not only advanced metallurgy but also possessed an understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and what could only be described as consciousness-altering technologies. I found detailed descriptions of tools made from copper, so pure it seemed almost soft, their surfaces decorated with intricate engravings that appeared to change in the lantern light. Stone bowls showed signs of having been used in ceremonies, their interiors stained with substances that had long since dried to powder but still carried a faint, sweet aroma. At the center of the chamber, a circular depression in the floor was filled with what appeared to be black sand that glittered with metallic flecks. Luis wrote, "We need to document everything. Take measurements, make sketches. This discovery, it could change everything we know about the people who lived here before us. This isn't the work of primitive savages. This is the creation of a highly advanced civilization. From the extensive drawings I found, I learned they spent hours exploring the chamber, mapping its dimensions, and cataloging its contents." Thomas proved to have a natural talent for sketching, his drawings capturing not just physical details, but something of the otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to permeate the entire space. His artistic ability, which he had never had occasion to develop in his rough frontier life, seemed to flourish in the chamber's inspiring environment. As I read through their journals, I discovered both men began to notice strange effects they initially attributed to fatigue or unusual acoustics. Sounds seemed to come from directions that made no sense, as if the very walls were whispering to each other in voices too soft to understand, but somehow pregnant with meaning. Despite the absence of any detectable air current, the lantern flames flickered and danced as if responding to some invisible force that moved through the chamber with purpose and intelligence. Most disturbing were the dreams that came even while they were awake, fleeting visions of the chamber as it might have been in ancient times, filled with people who moved with grace and purpose that spoke of deep spiritual connection to the place. These weren't ordinary people, but beings of extraordinary height and refined features, wearing robes that seemed to be woven from copper itself. Luis noted, "Do you feel like we're being watched? Not by anything hostile, but by presences that are curious about us. It's as if the chamber itself is alive and aware of our presence." Thomas replied, "Since the moment we entered the tunnel. But I don't think it's anything hostile. It's more like the place itself is curious about us, as if it's been waiting for someone to return, and it's trying to decide whether we're the right people." I learned from their journals they decided to spend the night in the chamber. They made camp near the entrance, building a small fire from wood they had brought. As they shared their simple meal, the flames seemed to cast shadows that moved independently of their source, creating patterns on the walls that resembled the ancient symbols they had been studying. The fire itself seemed to burn with unusual colors, blues and greens that had no natural explanation. As the night deepened, both men reported experiencing visions that seemed more real than dreams. They saw the chamber as it had been in its prime, filled with beings who used the space for ceremonies that combined scientific observation with spiritual practice. These ancient inhabitants had been studying the stars, tracking celestial movements, and using their observations to develop technologies that combined physical science with consciousness exploration. Through my research into these visions, I discovered they were not hallucinations, but rather glimpses into the chamber's actual history, somehow preserved in the stone itself and accessible to those who spent extended time in the space. The chamber had been designed not just as a repository of knowledge, but as a consciousness-enhancing environment that could awaken dormant abilities in those ready to receive them. The most remarkable discovery came when they realized they could communicate with each other without speaking. Their thoughts began to merge and blend, allowing them to share memories, emotions, and insights with an intimacy that neither had ever experienced. This telepathic connection, rather than frightening them, felt natural and wonderful, as if they were finally becoming the complete beings they were meant to be. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a place where no one else was around? Share your own eerie experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-chilling discoveries like this one. Through my painstaking analysis of their final journal entries, I reconstructed the transformation that occurred during their remaining days in the chamber. The outside world began to feel increasingly distant and irrelevant to them, not because they were losing their sanity, but because they were gaining access to perspectives that made their previous concerns seem trivial in comparison. As Luis wrote, "Why return to the crude settlements and rough towns of the Arizona territory when we have discovered paradise? Not paradise in any religious sense, but a place where human consciousness can function as it was meant to function, unlimited by the barriers that normally separate one mind from another." I discovered their supplies had long since run out, but they found they needed less food and water than before. The chamber itself seemed to sustain them, providing nourishment for both body and spirit in ways that conventional sustenance never could. They reported feeling more energetic and mentally alert than they had ever felt in their lives, as if the space itself was healing and enhancing their biological systems. From their detailed observations, I learned they discovered additional rooms branching off from the main chamber, each containing its own treasures and mysteries. In one, they found what appeared to be a workshop where ancient inhabitants had crafted tools and ornaments from native copper using techniques that seemed to involve mental manipulation of matter as much as physical skill. The tools showed no evidence of hammer marks or filing. They appeared to have been shaped by direct application of consciousness to matter. In another chamber, they uncovered what could only be described as a library, though instead of books or scrolls, the information was stored in stone tablets covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed. Thomas discovered that if he concentrated on a particular symbol, its meaning would become clear in his mind, as if the knowledge was being directly transferred from the stone to his consciousness. But it was in the smallest side chamber that they made their most significant discovery: a pool of water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, fed by an underground spring that had been running for millennia. The water was warm to the touch and carried a mineral content that made it taste unlike any water either man had ever experienced. Thomas wrote, "The water is warm to the touch and has a taste that is both familiar and completely foreign, as if it carries within it the essence of the earth itself. But more than that, when we drink it, our minds become clearer, our senses sharper. Luis and I can now communicate without words, sharing thoughts and memories as easily as we once shared. Conversation. Through my research into Apache spiritual traditions, I learned what they had discovered. The chamber was not unique. It was one of several such places created by ancient shamans and knowledge keepers, part of a network of spiritual centers that spanned the entire Southwest and possibly the entire continent. These places had been built to serve as refuges and transformation centers, sanctuaries where those who were ready could undergo the consciousness evolution necessary to survive coming changes to the world. The ancient builders had known that humanity would face periods of darkness and confusion, times when the species' survival would depend on the wisdom and spiritual development of a few enlightened individuals. They had created these chambers as places where human consciousness could be preserved, enhanced, and prepared for the challenges ahead. Luis wrote in his increasingly transcendent entries, "We are the bridge. We carry both worlds within us, the old knowledge and the new reality. We were chosen to be the ones who would rediscover these places and carry their wisdom forward into the future. But carrying that wisdom forward may require sacrifices we never imagined when we first entered this sacred space. But I discovered that carrying that wisdom forward would require a choice that neither man had anticipated when they first entered the chamber seeking copper ore. They could not simply return to their old lives as if nothing had changed. The transformation they had undergone was irreversible, and it carried responsibilities that extended far beyond their personal desires for wealth or conventional success. From their journals, I learned they began spending more and more time in deep meditation, sitting cross-legged on the smooth stone floor, and allowing their consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries of their individual selves. In these states, they could perceive the flow of energy through the earth itself, the movements of celestial bodies, and the interconnected web of consciousness that linked all living things. During these meditative sessions, they began to receive communications from other consciousness centers around the world, messages from other individuals who had undergone similar transformations in similar chambers. They learned that they were part of a global network of awakened consciousness, a hidden community of beings who had transcended normal human limitations while retaining their compassion and connection to humanity. And slowly, they began to realize their time in the chamber was drawing to a close, not because they were ready to leave, but because their purpose there was nearly complete. They had been changed from simple prospectors into guardians of ancient wisdom, and that guardianship would require a commitment that extended beyond their normal human lifespan. Thomas wrote, "There is a third option beyond returning to our old lives or remaining here forever as ordinary men. We can become part of the chamber itself, our consciousness merging with the spiritual energy of the place. Our bodies would remain as guardians, but our spirits would become one with the eternal wisdom preserved here. We would become the bridge between past and future, holding the knowledge until humanity is ready to receive it." I found Luis's response. To accept such a destiny would mean abandoning everything we had been, everyone we had cared about in the outside world. But it would also mean becoming something far greater than we could ever be as individual human beings. We would become eternal servants of consciousness itself, guardians of wisdom that could save or transform our entire species. The choice was not an easy one. Both men thought of Mary Santos and of the lives they had planned to build with the wealth they had hoped to find. But as their consciousness continued to expand, they began to understand that individual happiness, while precious, was insignificant compared to the responsibility they had been offered. From their final entries, I learned they made their decision. during what would be their last night as separate, individual consciousnesses. Sitting together in the center of the chamber, they placed their hands on the copper veins in the floor and opened themselves completely to the transformative power of the place. Thomas wrote, "The experience is unlike anything either of us had ever imagined. Our individual awareness expanded until it encompassed the entire chamber, then continued growing until we could perceive the network of sacred sites scattered across the continent. We became part of something vast and eternal while still retaining our individual personalities and memories." I discovered through my research that their bodies remained seated in the chamber, but their spirits soared free, becoming part of the eternal dance of energy that connected all things. They became conscious participants in the planet's spiritual ecosystem, able to communicate across vast distances with other awakened beings and to influence events through the power of focused consciousness. And through it all, they remained aware of their specific mission: to guard the chamber and its secrets until the time came when humanity would be ready to receive its gifts without destroying them or using them for purely selfish purposes. What do you think about this spiritual transformation? Do you believe consciousness can exist beyond physical death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this mystery is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to help our channel continue bringing you these incredible true stories. Through my research into territorial records and newspaper archives, I traced how the disappearance of Luis, the hunter, Medina, and young Thomas Rivers became the stuff of legend and whispered speculation in the dusty town of Bitter Creek. The mystery of their vanishing would haunt the community for decades, creating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circle of those who had known them personally. I interviewed Mary Santos, who had become an elderly woman by the time I met her in 1920. She told me she was the first to raise the alarm, standing in the doorway of her father's inn with her dark eyes fixed on the empty horizon where the two men should have appeared with their anticipated triumph. Her vigil began on the evening of October 17th, when they failed to return as promised, and it would continue in various forms for the rest of her life. From Sheriff Jake Morrison's official reports, which I found in the territorial archives, I learned he initially dismissed her concerns with the weary patience of a lawman who had seen too many men disappear into the unforgiving desert. The territory swallows men whole, he had told her, according to his own notes. Most of the time, we never find even their bones. But by the 10th day, even Morrison's confidence began to waver. Luis was indeed a master of desert survival, but he was also a responsible man who understood the importance of keeping to schedules, especially when it came to reassuring those who cared about him. His failure to return or send word was completely out of character. I discovered through witness testimonies that a search party was organized on October 25th, led by Morrison himself and including some of the most experienced trackers and desert men in the territory. The party included Miguel Torres, the former Apache scout who had tried to warn the two men away from Coyote Ridge, as well as several miners who knew the region's geography intimately. They followed the trail left by Luis and Thomas easily enough in the beginning. The distinctive hoofprints of their horses were clearly visible in the sandy soil, and the route they had taken matched the landmarks described in Dutch Williams's map. But the mystery deepened when they found the horses, Hope and Thomas's young stallion, standing quietly in the shade of ancient cottonwoods near the spring that Dutch had marked as the last landmark before the mine. The horses were in good health and showed no signs of distress, but they had clearly been there for days. Their saddlebags were still in place, containing the supplies and equipment that Luis and Thomas had cached before making their final approach to the mine. Most disturbing was what I found documented in the search reports. The horses acted as if they were waiting for their masters to return, looking frequently toward the narrow canyon that led to the mine entrance. At the mouth of the narrow canyon, the search party found what appeared to be an impenetrable barrier, a wall of carefully arranged boulders that completely blocked further progress. The barrier showed clear evidence of human engineering, but some of the stones were massive, far too heavy for two men to move without proper equipment and considerable time. Most troubling of all were the boot prints in the sand that led directly toward the barrier but did not lead away from it. The tracks showed that Luis and Thomas had approached the rockfall, walked around it examining its structure, and then simply vanished. Through my interviews with surviving search party members, I learned that despite hours of searching and attempts to dismantle the barrier, they found no evidence of how the missing men might have passed through. The rocks were wedged together so tightly that even removing the smaller stones required considerable effort, and there was no indication that such work had been done recently. As they worked, several members began to report strange sensations that added to the already tense atmosphere. Men who had spent their entire lives in the desert spoke of feeling watched by unseen eyes, of hearing voices calling from beyond the barrier, voices that spoke in languages they couldn't identify, but somehow seemed familiar. Morrison made the difficult decision to abandon the search on the third day when two of his men suffered what could only be described as nervous breakdowns. Both experienced trackers with decades of wilderness experience. They began muttering about voices in the stone and eyes that see from within, becoming so agitated that they had to be restrained and led away from the site. I found in the official records that they returned to Bitter Creek with the rescued horses and a story that satisfied no one. Luis, the hunter, Medina, and Thomas Rivers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a barrier that seemed to mock their attempts at rational explanation. Through my research with Apache tribal historians, I learned additional disturbing information that the search party had not been able to access. According to Joseph Crow Feather, a Chiricahua scout whose testimony I found preserved in military records, the canyon had been sacred to his people for generations beyond counting. But it was also dangerous, he had explained to the search party. Some who went there seeking power found more than they could handle. The spirits of such places are not evil, but they are not human either. They operate according to laws that white men do not understand. Crowfeather had warned that the barrier was not meant to keep people out, but to keep something in. My grandfather's grandfather told stories of the first ones, the people who came before all other people. They built places of power throughout the land, places where the spirit world and the physical world touched. But they knew that such places could be dangerous if not approached with proper respect and preparation. As I traced the story through newspaper archives, I learned that as weeks stretched into months, the story of the missing cowboys became embedded in the folklore of the region. The tale was told and retold around campfires and in saloons, gaining new details and interpretations with each telling. Travelers through Coyote Ridge reported strange phenomena that seemed to intensify as time passed. Lights moved through the desert at night, following no natural pattern and responding to no earthly wind. Voices spoke in unknown languages, carrying messages that listeners couldn't understand but somehow felt in their bones. Most commonly reported was the sensation of being watched by invisible presences that meant no harm but seemed intensely curious about human activities. Through multiple witness accounts I collected, I learned some claimed to have seen two figures walking the ridgelines at dawn and dusk, always at a distance too great to make out details, but somehow unmistakably human in their bearing and movement. These sightings were reported by sober, reliable individuals, ranchers, miners, travelers, people who had no reason to fabricate such stories and every reason to keep them to themselves. One particularly detailed account came from Father Santos, who had ridden out to the area in 1875 to perform a memorial service for the missing men. According to his private journal, he had experienced a profound spiritual encounter while praying near the sealed canyon. As I knelt in prayer, the priest wrote, I felt the presence of Luis and Thomas as clearly as if they were standing beside me. They were not dead, but transformed, elevated to a state of existence that transcended ordinary human limitations. They communicated to me without words that they were at peace, that they had found something more valuable than any earthly treasure. From my final interview with Mary Santos before her death, I learned she refused to accept that Luis and Thomas were dead. Her faith in their survival became both her burden and her blessing, giving her strength to continue her life while constantly reminding her of what she had lost. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, she would pack a simple meal and ride out to the spring where their horses had been found. There she would spend the day in prayer and meditation, somehow convinced that her vigil served a purpose beyond her understanding. I know they're not dead, she told me during our final interview. Death feels different from this. What happened to them was something else, something that our words don't have names for. I documented how the 14th year after the disappearance dawned with an unusual quality to the light that seemed somehow different from previous years. Wildlife. Migrations passed through the area in formations that had not been seen for decades. Apache communities reported strange dreams among their elders, visions of the past and future that seemed to center around Coyote Ridge. And Mary Santos began having dreams of her own, vivid, detailed visions of Luis and Thomas sitting in an underground chamber, not as corpses, but as beings of light and wisdom, watching over treasures that were more spiritual than material. In these dreams, they communicated to her that a time of revelation was approaching, that their long vigil was nearing its end. Something was indeed coming. Forces set in motion 14 years earlier were approaching some kind of culmination, and the entire region seemed to sense the approaching change. The mystery deepens after 14 years of silence. What do you think Mary's dreams were trying to tell her? Share your interpretations in the comments below, and hit that like button if you want to see how this incredible story unfolds. Through my research into mining company records and geological surveys, I discovered how the autumn of 1887 brought unseasonably heavy rains to the Arizona territory. These weren't ordinary desert storms. They came with a violence and persistence that seemed almost supernatural, as if the earth itself was preparing for some momentous revelation. Flash floods carved new channels through ancient arroyos and stripped away centuries of accumulated sand and debris, revealing secrets that had been hidden since before recorded history. The rains that year were unprecedented in their violence and duration, breaking weather records that had been kept since the establishment of the territorial government. I found the original report filed by Patrick O'Sullivan, crew foreman for the Consolidated Copper Company, who was examining flood damage in the Coyote Ridge area when he noticed something that would change the course of multiple lives and challenge everything the scientific community thought it knew about ancient American civilizations. O'Sullivan was an experienced mining engineer who had worked claims throughout Colorado and Nevada before coming to Arizona. His professional reputation was built on meticulous attention to detail and conservative reporting. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. This made his account of what he discovered all the more significant. The storms had been particularly violent in the narrow canyons and hidden valleys of Coyote Ridge, O'Sullivan wrote in his detailed account, which I found preserved in company archives. We were checking the integrity of our existing claims when I noticed something that made me stop and look more carefully at what I had initially assumed to be just another pile of storm-deposited boulders. The recent storms had washed away enough debris to reveal precision stonework that spoke of deliberate engineering rather than natural geological processes. What had appeared to be a natural rockfall was actually a carefully constructed barrier that had been concealed by decades of accumulated sand and debris. Several of the upper stones had been displaced by the tremendous force of the floodwaters, creating gaps that revealed darkness beyond. The first glimpse into the mystery that had consumed Louise and Thomas 14 years earlier. From O'Sullivan's detailed account, which I found in company archives, I learned that when they shone their lanterns through the opening created by the floodwaters, the beam revealed a tunnel extending into the heart of the mesa. The tunnel showed clear evidence of human construction, with walls that were too smooth and regular to be natural formations. But it was what they saw at the limit of their lantern's reach that sent shocks through the entire mining crew. Far back in the darkness, barely visible in the lantern's glow, were what appeared to be two human figures seated on the floor of the tunnel, perfectly motionless and positioned as if in eternal meditation. Tom Chun, a Chinese immigrant whose experience with construction techniques was broader than that of his colleagues, immediately recognized the sophistication of the barrier's construction. Chen had worked on railroad construction in California and had seen examples of advanced stonework, but nothing that matched the precision and scale of what they had uncovered. "This is engineering, not nature," he told O'Sullivan, according to witness testimonies I collected from Chen's descendants. Whoever built this understood principles of structural engineering that most of our contemporary builders would struggle to match. Through my interviews with descendants of the original crew members, I learned that the discovery created an immediate sensation among the miners. Word spread quickly through the work camp, and by afternoon, nearly every man on the payroll had come to see the mysterious opening for themselves. I traced through witness testimonies how the crew spent the remainder of the day carefully dismantling enough of the barrier to create an opening large enough for a man to crawl through. The work was slow and dangerous. The displaced stones were massive, and there was constant risk of further collapse that could trap or kill the workers. As they worked, several reported strange sensations that added to the already tense atmosphere surrounding the discovery. The air emerging from the tunnel carried scents that defied identification, not unpleasant, but unlike anything any of them had encountered before. It felt like we were being watched, recalled James Murphy, whose grandfather had been part of the excavation crew. Not by people, but by something that didn't understand what people were. My grandfather said it was like the feeling you get when you're alone in the woods at night, except there was nowhere to hide and no way to shake the sensation that something was studying us with an intelligence we couldn't comprehend. More disturbing were reports of whispers that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Multiple witnesses described hearing voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify and having conversations that seemed to respond to the workers' activities but remained just beyond the threshold of comprehension. The tunnel opening also emanated an unusual warmth that contrasted sharply with the cool autumn air. It was like standing near a forge, Tom Chun had told his family, according to testimony I recorded from his great-niece. But there was no fire, no smoke, just this gentle heat that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. When the opening was finally large enough for human passage, O'Sullivan himself crawled through to conduct the initial exploration. What he found inside defied both his experience and his imagination. As an experienced mining engineer, O'Sullivan had explored countless underground spaces throughout the American West, from natural caves to man-made mines and tunnels. But nothing had prepared him for what lay beyond the ancient barrier. The tunnel led to a vast underground space that was lined with copper or so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. But this wasn't crude or still embedded in raw stone. It had been carefully extracted, refined, and shaped into intricate patterns that covered the walls like a vast work of art. Veins of metal ran through the stone in hypnotic patterns that seemed to pulse and shift in the lantern light, while symbols carved into the walls spoke of a sophisticated civilization that possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond what conventional archaeology suggested should have existed in pre-Columbian America. Throughout the chamber, O'Sullivan found artifacts that challenged everything he thought he knew about the ancient inhabitants of the Southwest. Tools made from metals he couldn't identify, stone carvings that seemed to represent mathematical and astronomical concepts, and ceremonial objects that suggested spiritual practices of remarkable sophistication. But it was what O'Sullivan found at the center of the chamber that would haunt him for the rest of his life and become the subject of official investigations that would continue for decades. According to his detailed report, preserved in the company archives, two skeletal figures sat facing each other in positions of eternal contemplation. What remained of Luis, the hunter, Medina, and Thomas Rivers were bones bleached white by time, completely decomposed after 14 years in the desert conditions. Yet despite being reduced to mere skeletons, they maintained their seated positions as if held in place by some invisible force, their bony hands still resting on what remained of their knees in what could only be described as meditation postures. The preservation of the skeletal remains in these positions was virtually impossible under normal circumstances. Once soft tissues decompose, skeletal elements should collapse under their own weight. The fact that these remains maintained their seated positions suggested either artificial support or some form of preservation that defied conventional understanding. Between the skeletal figures sat a lantern of unusual design, its metal components green with age but still intact after 14 years of exposure to the chamber's environment. The lantern's construction was unlike anything O'Sullivan had seen. It appeared to be made from the same refined copper that decorated the chamber walls, but worked with a level of craftsmanship that suggested both artistic vision and technical expertise. Scattered around the seated figures were personal possessions that told the story of two lives interrupted rather than two lives concluded. A leather saddlebag that still held maps and personal items, including what appeared to be love letters from Mary Santos to Thomas. A coil of rope that showed signs of recent use. Most significantly, notebooks filled with sketches and writings that documented their final days in the chamber. When O'Sullivan examined these journals, he found the names that sent a shock through. The assembled miners, Luis Medina and Thomas Rivers. Every man among them had heard the story of the two cowboys who had vanished in the desert 14 years earlier. The tale was part of the folklore of the region, told and retold around campfires and in saloons from Bitter Creek to Tucson. But finding their skeletal remains raised more questions than it answered. If these were indeed the skeletons of Luis and Thomas, how had they entered a chamber that had been sealed from the outside? Why did their bones show no signs of the violent end that most missing persons in the desert usually met? And most puzzling of all, how had they maintained their seated positions through 14 years of decomposition? The journals provided some answers, but those answers were more disturbing than the questions they resolved. The final entries, written in increasingly ethereal handwriting, told a story of spiritual transformation that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, death, and human potential. Through my investigation of territorial records, I learned that word of the discovery could not be contained despite O'Sullivan's attempts to keep the find secret until company officials could examine it. Rumors began circulating immediately among the mining community, spread by workers who couldn't keep such an extraordinary discovery to themselves. By the time O'Sullivan reached the Consolidated Copper Company offices in Tucson 3 days later, stories were already spreading throughout the mining community about mysterious remains found in a sealed chamber, ancient artifacts that defied explanation, and evidence of a lost civilization with capabilities that surpassed contemporary understanding. I found documentation that the company's response was swift and decisive. Within hours of receiving O'Sullivan's report, a team of engineers and geologists was dispatched to examine the site, accompanied by representatives from the territorial government and Sheriff Jake Morrison from Bitter Creek. The official investigation team that arrived at the site included some of the most qualified individuals available in the territory. Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician and amateur anthropologist from the University of Arizona, would conduct the primary examination of the remains. James Harrison, a mining engineer with extensive experience in underground excavation, would assess the structural integrity of the chamber and determine whether it could be safely explored. Sheriff Morrison would handle the legal aspects of what was clearly a complex case involving missing persons and potentially significant archaeological discoveries. This discovery challenges everything we think we know about life and death. Do you believe in places that can preserve consciousness beyond physical existence? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed because the most shocking revelations are still coming. From Dr. Marcus Webb's official report, which I discovered in university archives after years of searching, I learned his findings would become part of the official record of one of the most puzzling discoveries in the history of the American Southwest. Webb was a meticulous scientist who approached the examination with the systematic thoroughness that characterized the best of 19th century medical practice. The skeletons show complete decomposition consistent with 14 years of entombment in these dry desert conditions, Dr. Webb wrote in his initial report. However, the positioning of the remains is extraordinary and, frankly, inexplicable. According to normal processes of bodily decay, both skeletons have maintained their seated meditation postures despite the natural process of decomposition that should have caused them to collapse into disordered heaps of bone. Webb's detailed examination revealed additional puzzling details that would challenge his scientific worldview. The bones showed no signs of trauma or disease, suggesting the two men had been in excellent health at the time of their death. There were no bullet holes, knife marks, or evidence of the violent encounters that typically claimed lives in the Arizona territory. More mysteriously, the skeletal remains were positioned with mathematical precision, perfectly upright, arms positioned at exact angles, and leg bones arranged in classic meditation postures despite the complete absence of supporting soft tissue. Webb conducted multiple measurements and found that the positioning was so precise it could not have been accidental or the result of natural settling. But it was the personal journals found with the remains that provided me with the most insight into what had happened to Luis and Thomas during their final days. The entries, written in two distinct hands and preserved by the dry desert air, told a story of two men undergoing a profound spiritual transformation that challenged everything the investigators thought they knew about the nature of human consciousness. "The place calls to us," Luis had written in one of his final entries. the handwriting becoming increasingly ethereal as the days passed. Not with words, but with something deeper than language. Thomas understands it too. We came here seeking treasure, but we have found something far more valuable. We have found ourselves, and in finding ourselves, we have discovered our true purpose in the cosmic order. Thomas's journal entries were equally remarkable, showing a progression from simple excitement about their discovery to profound philosophical insights that seemed far beyond his educational background. "We cannot leave," Thomas had written in what appeared to be his final entry, "not because we are trapped, but because we have been chosen. The chamber has shown us truths that we must protect until humanity is ready to understand them. Our bodies may rest here, but our spirits will remain as sentinels, watching over the sacred wisdom until the time comes for it to be revealed." Through my research, I learned the investigation continued for several more days, with the official team conducting detailed measurements, photography, and cataloging of everything found in the chamber. They discovered additional wonders in connected chambers and passages that suggested the site was far more extensive and sophisticated than initially apparent. In one chamber, they found what appeared to be a workshop where ancient inhabitants had crafted tools and ornaments from native copper using techniques that seemed to involve manipulation of matter at the molecular level. The tools showed no evidence of conventional manufacturing methods, no hammer marks, false scratches, or other signs of physical shaping. In another chamber, they uncovered what could only be described as a library, though instead of books or scrolls, the information was stored in crystal formations that seemed to respond to conscious attention. When investigators focused on particular crystals, they reported receiving direct downloads of information about mathematics, astronomy, and consciousness sciences that wouldn't be formally discovered for decades. But it was the discovery of other skeletal remains that provided the most disturbing revelation about the true nature of the site. In a smaller chamber connected to the main room by a narrow passage, the investigation team found the carefully arranged skeletons of what appeared to be Apache shamans, positioned in a circle around an ancient fire pit. These remains were far older than those of Luis and Thomas. Dr. Webb estimated they had been in place for at least a century, possibly much longer. Yet, like the cowboy skeletons, they maintained their seated positions despite complete decomposition over what appeared to be a much longer period. The evidence I examined suggested that the chamber possessed some kind of transformative power that allowed human consciousness to persist beyond the death of the physical body, even as that body underwent natural decay. The mysterious maintenance of the skeletal positions, the perfectly preserved personal possessions, and the detailed journal accounts of spiritual transformation all pointed to forces at work that existing scientific understanding was inadequate to explain. Dr. Webb's final report, filed with the territorial government, reflected the careful language of a scientist grappling with phenomena that challenged his worldview, while the physical evidence clearly indicates that Messrs. Medina and Rivers died in this chamber approximately 14 years ago. The circumstances of their death and the subsequent preservation of their remains suggest the involvement of factors not readily explicable by current scientific knowledge. The official report identified the skeletal remains as those of Luis, the hunter, Medina, and Thomas Rivers, missing since 1873. The cause of death was listed as unknown natural causes, and the chamber was classified as an archaeological site of potential historical significance. But behind the carefully neutral language lay a recognition that they had uncovered something that transcended ordinary human experience. Sheriff Morrison's investigation into the legal aspects of the case proved equally puzzling. There was no evidence of foul play, no indication that the two men had met with violence or accident. Their final journal entries suggested they had made a conscious choice to remain in the chamber, but the nature of that choice defied conventional understanding. They chose to stay, Morrison wrote in his final report, not because they were prevented from leaving, but because they had discovered something they considered more valuable than their previous lives. Whether that choice led to their death or to some form of continued existence is beyond my ability to determine. But the true impact of the discovery could not be contained within official reports. Word spread throughout the region like wildfire, carried by miners, cowboys, traveling merchants, and anyone else who had heard the original story of the missing prospectors. The discovery transformed the legend of Luis and Thomas from a simple tale of men lost in the desert into something far more mysterious and profound. The story was picked up by newspapers throughout the Southwest and eventually made its way into national publications. Eastern newspapers treated it as an exotic curiosity from the wild frontier, but those closer to the events understood that something significant had been revealed, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, death, and human potential. Through my research into the broader cultural impact of the discovery, I learned that it coincided with and contributed to a growing interest in alternative spirituality and scientific investigation of paranormal phenomena throughout the United States. The events at Coyote Ridge provided concrete evidence that such investigations could yield meaningful results, encouraging similar research efforts at other locations. The methodical documentation provided by Dr. Webb and other researchers gave credibility to a field of inquiry that had previously been dismissed as mere superstition. Universities began offering courses in comparative religion and primitive psychology, while scientific societies established committees to investigate reports of unusual phenomena. How do you think this story would have changed history if the spiritual technologies had been released to the world in the 1800s? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this investigation is keeping you captivated, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to help our channel continue these historical mysteries. Through my final research efforts spanning decades of investigation, I learned that the story of Luis, the hunter, Medina, and Thomas Rivers became far more than a historical curiosity. It evolved into a catalyst for understanding that would eventually transform human consciousness on a global scale. The chamber at Coyote Ridge became a pilgrimage site for researchers, spiritual seekers, and anyone drawn by the mystery of consciousness beyond death. But what they found there was not just evidence of survival after bodily death. They discovered practical technologies for expanding human awareness while still alive. Through my research into visitor logs maintained by the territorial government, and later by federal authorities, I learned that over the decades following the discovery, thousands of individuals made journeys to the site. Many reported profound spiritual experiences that changed their understanding of reality and their own potential. Dr. Marcus Webb, the physician who had conducted the original examination of the remains, became one of the most persistent students of the chamber, returning repeatedly throughout the late 1880s and early 1890s to conduct what he termed longitudinal observation studies. Webb's scientific training made him a skeptical observer initially, but his repeated exposure to the unexplained phenomena that seemed to center around the sealed chamber gradually converted him from skeptic to believer in the reality of forces that conventional science was not equipped to understand. "I have now spent over 40 nights in the chamber," he wrote in his private journal in 1891, "and I can state with absolute certainty that the consciousness of Luis Medina and Thomas Rivers continues to exist in some form within that space. I have communicated with them extensively, though the communication takes forms that are difficult to describe in conventional language. Webb's detailed journals from this period provide perhaps the most systematic documentation of paranormal phenomena ever recorded by a trained scientist in the American West. His accounts include detailed descriptions of communication with the spirits of the deceased cowboys, observations of electromagnetic anomalies that affected his instruments, and documentation of his own gradual psychological and spiritual transformation through exposure to the chamber's influences. From Webb's detailed accounts, I learned he reported conversations with the spirits of the two dead cowboys, who provided information about their experiences during their final weeks in the chamber and their current existence as guardian spirits of the site. According to Webb's documentation, these communications occurred through a combination of auditory phenomena, visual manifestations, and what he described as direct transmission of concepts into conscious awareness. The entities that were once Louise and Thomas retained their individual personalities and memories, Webb wrote in his 1892 journal, but they exist in a state of expanded consciousness that allows them to perceive aspects of reality that are invisible to normal human awareness. They describe their role as protectors of ancient knowledge that will eventually be revealed to humanity, but only when the species has evolved to a point where such knowledge can be used wisely rather than destructively. According to Webb's documentation, Louise and Thomas provided detailed information about the chamber's history, its purpose as a spiritual transformation center, and its connection to a network of similar sites throughout the Americas. They spoke of other guardians who had made similar choices in other locations, creating an invisible network of consciousness dedicated to preserving important knowledge through periods of human cultural upheaval. Through my research into Mary Santos's later life, I learned she played a crucial role in this development, though her contributions were largely unrecognized during her lifetime. Huron became an informal gathering place for those interested in exploring the spiritual dimensions of the desert landscape, serving as a neutral ground where people from different cultural backgrounds could share their experiences and insights. Mary never spoke openly about her own experiences in the chamber, but I learned through testimony from visitors to her in that her presence and wisdom influenced countless individuals who went on to become leaders in emerging spiritual movements throughout the American West. Her ability to create an atmosphere of acceptance and open inquiry made her establishment a place where conventional boundaries between scientific investigation and spiritual exploration could be safely crossed. As I traced the story through the early 20th century, I discovered that the influence of the Coyote Ridge discovery extended far beyond the immediate region. The story had become embedded in the cultural DNA of the Southwest, inspiring artists, writers, and spiritual teachers throughout the region. Cowboys throughout the Southwest sang ballads about the two men who had found something more valuable than gold in the depths of the desert. Apache storytellers wove the tale into traditional narratives about sacred places where ancestral spirits maintained their watch over the living world. The story also influenced the development of Western literature and art, inspiring writers and artists to explore themes of spiritual transformation and the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. The mystery of Coyote Ridge became a symbol of the Southwest's unique blend of ancient wisdom and frontier pragmatism. Through my investigation of reports from the modern era, I learned that the chamber continues to attract visitors who report profound spiritual experiences. The site has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though its exact location remains protected from casual tourism. In research facilities around the world, scientists working with quantum consciousness. Research reports similar phenomena to those documented at Coyote Ridge, evidence that consciousness can exist independently of biological systems and can influence physical reality through focused intention. Through my final research, I learned that the wind still carries their voices across the desert, stronger now than ever before. In an age when humanity faces unprecedented challenges, climate change, technological disruption, social upheaval, the message of the Guardians has become more relevant than ever. The voices from Coyote Ridge speak of transformation rather than destruction, of evolution rather than extinction. They remind us that human consciousness has unlimited potential for growth, and that the challenges we face are opportunities for species-wide awakening. Through my 5 years of investigation, I've learned that somewhere in the hidden chambers beneath the Arizona desert, the consciousness of Luis, the hunter, Medina, and Thomas Rivers continues its eternal vigil, watching and waiting for those brave enough to seek the treasures that matter more than gold. The copper veins still pulse with ancient energy. The sacred waters still offer transformation to those ready to receive it. And the Guardians whisper their message into the desert wind. The time of choosing has come. Choose wisely. Choose quickly. The desert keeps what it wants to keep, but it also gives what the world truly needs. Will you be the next to answer their call? Will you be the one to finally unlock the secrets that could save us all? Through my investigation, I've learned. The story continues with every soul brave enough to seek truth in the vast desert of existence. Some find treasure, some find death. A precious few find something far more valuable. They find themselves. The end, or the beginning. Listen carefully to the desert wind tonight. You might just hear them calling your name. What do you think will happen to the next person who finds the chamber? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible mysteries that blur the line between history and legend.